It's time for us to begin this evening. If you would like to open up your Bibles, we're going to be looking at both Proverbs chapter 6 and Romans chapter 1 as two primary texts for tonight. But that's not all. We're going to dig into a couple other portions of the Old Testament, the New Testament, as well as make connections into our prior conversations and some of the stuff we'll look at in the future. Before we go any farther, let's go ahead and pause for a moment and bow our heads together in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the blessings that are bountifully given to us in life and in the relationships that we share. It's our hope tonight that as we open your word, you will enrich our understanding of ourselves, of the kingdom, and of you. Help our faith to mature and our confidence in our redemption to grow. And this is our prayer in your Son's name. Amen. So a couple of things to think about. Remember, our readings that come out of the book Mere Christianity are not for every single week. You may have noticed that already. And those are designed to kind of help us think about things from different perspectives and different ideas. The writing in that particular book should challenge you to a degree in one area or another. It may challenge you because you don't share similar experiences to C.S. Lewis. It may challenge you because he's asking questions that you haven't thought about before. And he has an answer that is rooted in his own understanding of God and of the Bible, but it may not match yours, and that's normal. That's life. That's okay. And that's going to be the fodder for some of our dialogues when we cover those particular areas. Tonight, though, we're going to lay groundwork to help us with just about every corner and aspect of our life. So our big question, our topic for tonight, is about as wide as you can get. So how do you know anything? And it is actually as broad as you might think it is. And how do we know anything at all? It's not just about discerning between good data and bad data. It's getting to the root of things. And how is it that we as independent creations actually develop the capacity to interact with everything around us in a way that is helpful, good, beneficial, and how do we frame all of these aspects to our understanding? There's quite a bit that goes into trying to break down the details. So in specific, my expectation for our conversation tonight is to give ourselves a good understanding as we glorify God, thank Him for giving us our minds, what we use to think, to know, to feel, to understand. And then by extension, make decisions that reflect that relationship. We have 100% control over our choices. Even though there are cultural factors that might limit what feels like our options, even though there are pressures upon us that we put or are forced, we still have the power of choice. It is the concept referred to sometimes as free will, but it is something that is unique to creation. And so before we get into our two primary texts, that's Proverbs 6 and Romans chapter 1, I want us to think back for a moment to Genesis 1. We're going to read next week 1 through 31 of chapter 1 for next week's class. But I want you to think for a moment in verses 26 and 27. God makes a statement regarding us as His creation that we repeat a lot. We say things like, we are made in the image of God. Now that's kind of leading us to ask this question, what does it then mean to be made in the image of God? Male and female, He created them. That's the end of the clause in that sentence. And so there's something connected in the ideas of being made in God's image that's adjacent, at least, to gender, that's going to help us understand our big question. How do we know anything? How do we know anything at all in that regard? So, first question that for us to think about is, what does it mean to you when you read that passage and it says we're made in God's image? What kind of things come to mind? To know good from evil maybe is a component in there somehow. Intellect, the capacity to know. That's a God-provided gift. To discern good and evil, and eventually to figure out what those two are. To know, to think, to reason. How about the ability to create? We don't create life from non-life, but we do create, right? And we also replicate, which also is in context in the text there. So the arts, whether they be visual or audible, all those are part of the same blessing basket that God has given us, as much as is logic, reason, engineering, the capacity to understand the universe as best as we can. All those things are all part of God's gift. But that's not all that's there, right? Because are there other aspects of what it means to be made in the image of God than just knowing good and evil and all the tendrils of our intellect?
Capacity to love.
Love. Emotion comes in as well. Our emotive capacity is a reflection of God. And another way to think about this is this terminology that's used here, because it's part of the larger creation narrative where God breathes life into man. It's the same word in the Greek Old Testament as what Paul says Timothy is the case for the scriptures being inspired or God-breathed. And so you have the logos, the word, being breathed to us, and you have us being breathed into creation, same kind of concepts that are linking us together with this larger picture of whatever it is God wants us to capture. Last thing is a key component of this. The logos being mentioned in John 1 that we mentioned, the word made manifest, isn't narrowly thought just as like the word being word on page. It's more inclusive of the idea of God. So Jesus is the manifestation of God as an idea to man, to his creation who share his image. That helps us begin to figure out where we kind of go from there with the knowledge that we're granted and all the things that would be included into it. And it stems from this basic question. If or given that, depending on where you are in your faith, God is, that then shifts our response to data, right? If I give you the data that says, in Romans chapter 1 and verse 16, the gospel is the power unto salvation, continues in the verse 17, let's say, unto all them who believe, to the Jew and the Gentile, etc. If you don't believe that God is, and maybe even additionally that he is a rewarder of them who earnestly seek him, if you don't believe that part, then that statement doesn't have much power, does it? The word will not move you, even though objectively, someone who says God is, say, that's accurate, it's real. The unbeliever will come and go, how do I know that that's the case? So that's the middle space of how do I know anything. If the first space is God gave me the capacity to, the second space is that middle one where I have to trust that God is. That gets us to a combined destination where we're going to try to spend a lot of time tonight, which is given that God is, and now he's granted to us his word. Now what do we do with that? How do we develop answers to questions? So let's start right now with a brief read of 11 verses. They're kind of short, so it won't take too long. Rich, do you want to read for us, if you've got that quick for us, in Proverbs chapter 6, verses 1 through 11? This is one of the many wisdom blocks in the text of Proverbs where there is a series of insightful ideas. It was also part of the reading for tonight, and so it's a kind of a reread as well. But whenever you're ready, Rich, that's chapter 6, verses 1 through 11.
All right. My son, if you have put up security for your neighbor, have given your pledge for a stranger, if you are snared in the words of your mouth, caught in the words of your mouth, then do this, my son, and save yourself. For you have come into the hand of your neighbor. Go hasten and plead urgently with your neighbor. Give your eyes no sleep, and your eyelids no slumber. And save yourself like a gazelle from the hand of the hunter, like a bird from the hand of the fowler. Go to the ant, O sluggard, consider her ways, and be wise. Without having any chief officer or ruler, she prepares her bread in the summer, gathers her food in the harvest. How long will you lie there, O sluggard? When will you rise from your sleep? A little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man.
Unintentionally, there's a great illustration that Les mentioned right before Bible class about getting out of bed, and you can remember what it is here in a second, Les, if you already haven't forgotten it. But I want you to think about what God does here in His Word. I'm going to call on Les in a second. He'll remember the comment. God tells us a truth. He says, hey, if you're in this situation, this is how you solve it. If you've caught yourself up in this relationship with your neighbor where you're beholden to them because of whatever calamity has gone on, maybe you were lazy, maybe you weren't, etc., go plead with them. Get out of it. Because now you have given yourself to your neighbor's hand. You're owned by them. It's very similar to the borrower is slave to the lender, but now with a different kind of parable type space. Then God does a second thing, and He says, I want you to look at my creation and see how it functions. And He uses that very familiar, how many of you have heard that story of the ant and the lazy sluggard before outside of a Bible class? How many have told that story outside of a Bible class? Not to your children. All right? So this picture is kind of familiar to us, right? Like, oh yeah, okay, this is industriousness. It provides for the future. And this is what slacker looks like. Slacker doesn't get out of bed. Slacker doesn't provide for their future. But God says, look at my creation, how I built it, how it functions. Look at their success. Nobody's even there's no alarm clock. They just go and do their thing. Now, we do that too. We do it sometimes for wisdom and sometimes for folly and joy. And Les, what's the number one reason that someone might get out of bed? What'd you say earlier?
I don't always jump up out of bed, but when I do, I have a cramp.
Right. So sometimes our getting out of bed quick isn't motivated because we got a job to do. It's because I got a cramp in my leg and I'm about to pass out. And actually, when that happens for most of us, you don't move very much at all. It's like, if I move any more, it might hurt more. Or maybe that's just me. But you see how we do this already, but our responses to these circumstances are built on something we've learned from a source that we've begun to trust. So, first area, God is. God gave me some insight about my creation, who I am, where I came from. Second area, maybe wisdom from experience. Third area, the creation around them. I look at the ants. I look at the animals. And what are they doing? It's the same thing we do. If we see ducks going north or south, we kind of, wait a minute, season changing? Or if your leg starts acting up and that old injury from football starts hurting, you're like, oh, twister's coming. I can just feel it right now. The rain's about to come. We have those experiences. We see our world around us and we respond because of trust and prior successes. And so part of our process in kind of building this knowledge base of how to understand and know is rooted not only in our confidence that God is, but also his big message, how we respond to these smaller details and these bits and pieces. Pause for a second right now, and we've talked about like wisdom choices or circumstances like the story in Proverbs is laid out for us. And I want to key into David's comment about our emotions and realize this. Identify 3 blessings, 3 good things in your life, and realize this. What you know about them, they all come from God. How you feel about them, it's all springing forth from how God designed you. You who are uniquely and wonderfully made are responding to part of your design as humanity in that. Whether it is compassion that you appreciate, whether it's the job that provides for your family's protection and care, your home, your family itself, the Christ. Figure out a list of 3 things that would fit, like I'm really thankful for them. And then, when you go home tonight, identify why those are the 3 things that came to the top of your list. Why are they that important to you? Because that'll help you shape a better appreciation of who you are and know yourself a little bit better. Whatever that answer was, it's a result of all of these factors. So let's go to another Proverbs text. And this is now Proverbs chapter 3, before we get into our text in Romans. Proverbs chapter 3. Stuart, I'm going to make you get there first, magically. And if you could read verses 5 and 6 for us, that'd be great.
Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths.
All right, so I've roughly laid out the idea that our capacity to reason comes from God. It's a reflection of who God is. How do we then use that capacity to start making value-based decisions on what's true and what's not true, what's beautiful and not beautiful, what's good and what's awful? How do we develop the capacity to reason those choices out? And let me ask it a different way. For those of you who have been around little kids a lot, do little kids typically love vegetables at the get-go? Eventually, a lot of us get there, right? But typically, the theory is they don't, right? And so what do parents typically do in response to that?
Sweeten them up.
We cover them up in queso. That's how you make broccoli tasty. Put cheese on top, and all of a sudden the broccoli's gone, and now it's a dessert, right? Or we hide them in other things. Or we deeply embed them in things and act like they're not there, and we slip them in on them because we know that there's some value nutritionally to those vegetables. Or we gradually keep introducing them to their diet. We reinforce the idea that this is good for them, even if they don't like it at first, because we know biologically their taste buds haven't fully grown up yet. They just don't know. They haven't ever had it before. Texture, taste, spiciness, all those things come into play. Do you realize that you do that as a developing human throughout all your life with ideas, with God's Word? First time you taste something, I don't like that at all. I really don't want to have to give that up, or I really don't want to have to start doing that. How many of us feel that the church pew is the most comfortable pew they've ever sat in? Are they the best chairs ever? I've been in most of your houses. Do you guys have pews in your rooms I don't know about? No, we don't like them, right? For that purpose at home. And we never go and buy them and say, I'm going to put 4 rows of pews in front of the television at my house because it's going to be the best. So coming to church isn't about the pew, right? It's not about the seats. I mean, they can be bad, and I've been in some really bad ones, and I've been in some better ones. There was a church that met up in Alpharetta for a while that was in an older 2 double wide trailer, and the church had recliners everywhere. So someone had donated recliners to them. They had a bunch of older members too. And so like you go in there, it was row after row of recliners. Not a great thing for a college kid on a long trip. It's like, oh, this is nice. But that's not the reason we're here. So then there's something else that we've been introduced to that makes us not worry so much about the comfort of the seat. And by the way, almost all the church pews are better than pews at the Braves game. They're bigger, more spacious, got more leg room. Nobody's yelling across the side of your ear. At least all the seats I've sat in. They just are. So what brings us here? What small bit of thing caused us to say, I want to come to church again? When you're a kid, what's the answer? Mama said you're going, right? Daddy said, get in the car, it's time to go to church. And you're like, okay. Eventually you choose on your own though, right? So what is that? What was the shift for you to go from the vegetable I didn't like to the broccoli that I love? The people around you might be part of it. Michael?
At first, Stuart read, not leaning on my own understanding.
So what does that say about ourselves when we can say that openly? What attribute of personal awareness are we using? Trust combined with an H word. Humility. Or if you're in Texas, the H vanishes and becomes humble. The H just kind of becomes Texan silent. And so you're humbled. All right? You're just going, I don't know everything. And you get okay with not knowing everything. And then you trust that there's somebody who probably knows that thing a little bit more than you do. And then eventually over time, you trust and you'll believe, hey, there's some consistency in what God is saying. I don't always know what's going on, but this advice seems to work out. So now you have a basket of possibilities that gets us to a point to say, all right, I tried leaning on my own understanding, and then I read about this guy named Solomon who tried it way more than I did, or at least it seems like he certainly did. And he came back and said, well, the end of the matter is to fear God and keep his commandments. Well, what's that all about? And so you start making these, okay, how do I even know to get there? Well, I can reason. I believe that God is. I've made logical steps based on all of the things that are around me to get to this point, to now be aware of who is involved. And that it's never just me alone. God's always part of the picture in this tapestry in some way, even if I say no to him. He doesn't vanish from the scene just because I act like he doesn't exist. You know, like when you're playing peekaboo with a kid, and the kid goes, oh, you peekaboo, and they put the blanket in front of him, and they freak out that you're gone. You're not gone. You're just obscured from view from the child. So I think there's something in that for us to continue to gravitate around, circle around, and to mature through, to go from God is to his message to me is useful, functional, to I admit that I don't know everything. I don't lean on my own understanding, to how close can I get to God? How emotionally, spiritually, and in all forms draw myself to him. Not because it's wise, because he knows things, but because there's a component of my compassion, love, and person who realizes satisfaction in my closeness to God, completion, or as Paul would write, perfection. Although perfection there is an idea of all the parts are all together. Because I'm made in his image. So all these components are reflective to my Creator. All my art, all my poetry, all the good songs and bad songs ever written are to a degree reflective of the creation. So there's a lot that we don't always put in the same basket of knowing how to determine things, knowing what truth is that actually is super encompassing all the things of life. So now that gets us to a counterpoint. And how many of you guys remember the second one from Romans? We can read it when we will in a second. But what goes on in Romans chapter 1? If you were to say in the lead up to this verse 16 that we all kind of have semi-memorized at different points in our lives, because the gospel is good news and it's to salvation. But what else is going on in Romans there that makes Paul talk about salvation in that regard? What had happened to the Gentile world? Right, it's the Paul Harvey bit that begins in verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. That's verse 18. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. That's verse 19. And it continues through verse 20 and following. So let's tie this together. The Proverbs, wisdom, said you can look at creation and you can see what we would call industriousness. They prepared for the winter without anyone telling them, and they got all their stuff ready. They had all their supplies ready. And he says, you sluggard, go at least be by the ants and try to do that. But you probably should get out of bed and get to work. That's the concept underlying that. Creation showed that. Paul, in writing to the brethren at Rome, says creation also reveals generally that God is. So let's use our reasoning factors for a second there and ask this question. How is it that the creation testifies to the existence of God?
A lot of people point to design.
So,
Design and structure.
yeah, and let me make a little blanket statement regarding that. When we point to design, we are not saying that the universe is mathematically precise in the ways that we want it to be, like all things square, or the earth being a perfect sphere. Because we know it's not, right? What's the general shape of the earth according to all of our research? Kind of like an egg, pear-looking thing. It's like not even. Of course, it is post-flood, and it's a living thing. Do you remember that the earth itself is alive? Like it is part of creation itself. It's not living in the flesh and blood, but it's living like everything else that God made that was alive. Volcanoes, that's kind of living, right? How many of us have been near an active or a semi-active volcano? So, you don't really want to be too close, right? Because what does the lava tube produce? Lava. And is lava good to touch? No, general rule, no, that's not really great. Like molten stone, not a good call. So, but it's a living thing to a degree. It's alive because it moves and it's part of the creation in the general sense. So all of this then, all this big picture testifies that there is more than just man. Further, we do that because of its complexity. The capacity of the human eye continues to exceed the capacity of most modern cameras in the way it functions. We can see things that no one single camera can do at any one time. Even though they can make a camera that can do one thing better than your eyes can do, our eyes do a multitude of things all the time. Right now, they are focusing on multiple objects and creating a clear focus of all of them using a single lens. Our cameras don't work that way, etc. It's like stuff like that is part of the complexity of the universe and its interconnectedness. We have plants that only exist and function in the ecosystem with other animals being part of their life cycle. The great sequoias of the West, for them to reproduce, they need snow that snow that precedes a fire so that the big seed pod, the massive one that crashes down, is protected by its landing into the snow. But it has to get hot enough to open up because of a fire. And that's not enough. They need a certain variety of ground squirrel to take the seed and plant it into the ground. That's how those particular trees tend to replicate, unless man gets involved and manages the tree. So that's a pretty complicated reproduction cycle for those trees to continue to exist as an illustration of the complexity of design in the most simplified sense. And the text in Romans goes on to elucidate kind of a long statement regarding God's creation and man's response to it. That's the point, though, because man substitutes their own God as a secondary answer. In this case, the context is broadly idolatry, but that's what man does. In absence of evidence of the Creator in their lives, they create their own creation ethos. That's uniform history from the people surrounding post-flood life to today. One could argue that's the primary realm of many of the modern worldviews, the secular worldview, etc., that there is a different thing than God, their appetites, man himself is his own God or whatever. But in the end, they're just substituting God for something else, even if it's themselves. And then they go and worship it. So that's that connection here between the Proverbs text illustrates how the Roman text explains that no matter where we are, God is going to be part of the equation, even if we reject him. And my view of this is this perspective, and this is how I think about evil quite a bit, because that's a lot of what's being discussed in this Romans text. When you strip away everything that is good out of any space or person, what grows in the absence is the pestilence that is evil. So if I was to take love out of our relationships, and there are cultures that have done that, and there are people who do that, what grows into its space, that vacant space in a person, is a form of evil, some form or another, some concept or another. Think about the relationships that matter the most to you and take love out of them. Do you have any interest in retaining that relationship at that point? If you don't love one another? Not at all. Like, love actually is that important, or anything else. Take what God calls beauty out of it. Then it's an awful, awful space. Take what is good out of anything, and that's what you end up with, a pestilence growing within something that was once healthy and whole. So in that, I think there's an important spot for us to recognize that we have the capacity to reason, we are expected to use it, and when you read the scriptures, you will find God expects us to ask him questions. There's a lot of times we ask like, well, God just explained it already. We don't have to ask him questions. Like, why should we question anything? One of the most powerful stories in the text of the Old Testament is the story of Job, where Job's asking questions. Now, does Job really appreciate how the answer is delivered to him? So that's a bit of wisdom. The questions you ask may have consequences you're not ready to really endure. But that's not specific to us because we're not Job. But God answered him out of the whirlwind. He says, who are you to question this? And yet he still got an answer. I was there before. I predate that and you. Further, think about all the interactions of the disciples, the seekers, the Gentiles, and the far off, even snakes known as Sadducees and Pharisees. They came to Jesus with questions, and he answered them. Now, did he answer them in ways that they all wanted to hear? No. Some of them, they came back and says, you brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath that is to come? So he identified parts of their character in them before they even opened. But some of them got very heartfelt, specific, clear answers. It's important for us to recognize that knowing anything requires for us to ask a question and to be okay with it. It's totally fine, especially if we're comfortable getting an answer that we don't like. You know, that's a hard part of life development, but it's a crucial one if we want to really get to a point of a great view of whom we are in the sight of our God. Even in the dialogue that takes place, Genesis 2 and 3, God asks questions of Adam and Eve. Hey, what happened here? Who told you that you were naked? Well, you see, it was this and then that. That's how interaction takes place. And this is also a spot where we can include something in the way in which we interact with all things. There's a method of process that takes place in communication. For years, we referred to that process using three kind of terms. We said it was possibly a command, or an example, or an inference. Does that seem like a familiar phrase group to you? Realize that that's not a biblical hermeneutic or a theological principle. It's actually how conversation works. Because if we just shift the words to a more generalized phrase of tell, show, and imply, that's how you say anything. If I was to say, hey, Stuart, how do we know who used to own that motorcycle you just purchased? What might you utilize to show or tell us about the prior owner of the motorcycle you just picked up? I'm probably getting them in trouble. I don't care.
That's what I was afraid of.
Yeah, well, then I don't care. I care about you, but this is fine. That motorcycle's not going anywhere anytime soon. It's a project. It will be here longer than the spare rims were. So what kind of evidence is there?
Places, relationship I've had.
Okay.
Within those places.
Yeah, and then is there any kind of badging on that motorcycle that was really specific?
There is on the front of it.
Yeah,
Some initials.
and so you might pull it up and do what? You would tell us or show us. Stuart's down in trouble. He'll be fine. He's a big boy. They just won't talk about it, and you can blame me. It's fine. But you would tell us and you'd show us. And then they would make an implication. Wait a minute. I know that name that's on it. I guess that I can use what you've just told me and shown me to imply who the prior owner was, right? Now, that's how communication works all the time. And that's actually the only way it works. There's no form of human communication that doesn't rely upon telling, showing, and implying. That's how we figure out what God wants us to know. If I say, read from the closing refrain parts of Matthew, and particularly Jesus' last instructions, he said, go forth and teach, right? And make disciples, and of those disciples, baptize them, etc. And so God has given a telling, also known as a command. Same thing. I'm like, I know what he wants now. Or maybe he showed me something. Maybe he opened up an event and said, hey, look at this. You see this? Maybe it's the book of Acts, chapter 20 and verse 7 that my hand is theoretically pointing at. And see, look, there's disciples together. They're gathered on the first day of the week. When we read that passage, what does that say? What were they doing on the first day of the week? They were gathered together to break bread. And the side note, always make sure you're not sitting by the window if it's open at night and Paul's preaching, because that's also something that's an example. This is a showing that has to be there. And you kind of make your reasoned understanding. You use your mind. God told me. God showed me. I've made an implication. By the way, all implications you choose to imply, like actually act on, you're inherently saying they're necessary. So there's that they are necessary at that point. You don't have to have the extra modifier of a necessary implication. It's just, it was implied. And so I did it. That's how communication functions. That's how God teaches us. And by the way, that's how we know anything. Because somehow or another, someone we trusted told us. Someone we trusted showed us. And we use that information to come up with a conclusion. Like, well, I should be baptized because I believe that Jesus is the Christ, and he said to be baptized. And then I learned that baptism also means a number of other things too. That's how this concept functions in the largest part of the space. Quick reminder for next week, we've got a reading from Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 31. That's the bulk of the chapter. And it's going to be focusing in on what are we? And I want to see this perspective for a second, and we need to begin to think of ourselves in at least two ways. It's easy to see ourselves as part of our fleshly bodies, right? That's the most familiar interaction we have with ourselves. But the New Testament and the Old Testament both tell us a story that we are more than just flesh and blood. That means that a human being, in all cases, is more than flesh and blood. And that's an important principle to put into play, especially as we begin to interact with how the world responds to the presence of human beings and how I understand myself, how I feel about things. You ever look in the mirror and go, I don't look like I used to? Like, what happened to me? Like, how did I get to this point? Where did all this rust come from? Like, I didn't used to have this. And why is it that the only time I can jump out of bed right now is because there's a cramp in my leg in the middle of the night? Otherwise, I have to kind of lever myself out. Because we've aged, and we all do that. But that's not all that we are. And so as you're reading through Genesis, and you're reading through the creation account and the story of God making all the things, hone in on the parts that help you understand that the creation itself is not limited to just the physical things, because there are hints in the story of creation that tell us about a realm that we can't see, about the hint of a spiritual realm. Any last thoughts or comments? Michael, did you have something?
Yeah, just one thing about how do I know anything, that question, whether I am grilling, fixing an airplane, or learning from the Bible. When I think about how I know anything, it's going to take work and effort. I'm going to trust people, I'm going to lean on people, but if I'm not going to put in the work and the effort, it's not going to work out very well.
Yeah. You know, there's a part of learning that is rigorous. And that doesn't matter if it's book learning, or learning on the job, or learning through life. It's work. And you make a decision to learn from all parts of it. Most of the best lessons in my life, I've learned because I did something that was a mistake, or someone else made a mistake, and I just simply said, I'm not doing that again. Or I'm certainly not doing it like that a second time. And if I'm smarter, I would learn from others' mistakes as well as I learned from my own. That's it for our class time tonight. And so next week we'll be looking at this topic of what is a human being. In the back, by the way, for those who will be here Sunday morning for Bible class, when Michael is teaching, there's a series of 10 question prompts that will be part of the discussion Sunday morning. And so you want to grab those if you can. Thanks, everybody.